Well, let me begin by thanking Barry for the invitation to be here, and also to compliment the Governor and Barry for their energy in continuing to organize and sponsor these activities. Every evening that I've been here in the audience, I have learned something, and it's been a terrific institution that Barry has developed here. What I want to talk about tonight, I think, dovetails nicely with Tom's presentation. What I'd like to talk about is the issue of government intervention in the economy, in markets, and in businesses. What I want to do is to start with a somewhat broader perspective and then focus more narrowly on the question of government's role in industries that are in distress. And I'll focus on two questions. One is, when is it that government should be involved? And secondly, if the government is to be involved, what methods of intervention should it use? So I want to convince you, or at least propose to you, that there really are limiting principles for government intervention in businesses. And I want to advance my list, at least, of criteria that distinguish cases worthy of government intervention and those where the government should stay out. And then I also want to convince you, or at least propose to you, some criteria for how it is the government can intervene with the highest chances of success. So, and equally importantly, to stay out of cases, or rather not to undertake methods that have much less good prospects for success. But in talking about this question, what I'd like to do is to begin in a land far away at a time long ago. Well, maybe not so far away or so long ago, but I'd like to go back to the year 1974, December 10, 1974 in particular. And I would like to imagine that we are in Stockholm, Sweden, in the concert hall, where the Royal Academy is awarding the Nobel Prize in economics. And as the Academy often has done, continues to do, they actually awarded it to two individuals. One individual on the left here is Gunnar Myrdal, the distinguished development economist of Swedish background himself, and an advocate of the Swedish model of democratic socialism, which, as you know, involved extensive government intervention in the economy, public enterprise, and the like, combined with thoroughgoing democratic processes. The other awardee on the right was Friedrich von Hayek. Let us not conclude that the Royal Academy does not have a sense of humor. Hayek, of course, was an Austrian, conservative Austrian, whose views of public enterprise, government intervention, much less socialism, was one of uncompromising opposition. So the Royal Academy had a challenge in fashioning the language to encompass both of these people's contribution at the same time, but they did succeed. But what's interesting, I think, is that as well as any two individuals, Myrdal and Hayek represented the two faces of economic thinking about government intervention in markets in the second half of the 20th century. As events played out, it would be Hayek, not the hometown favorite Myrdal, but Hayek, whose thinking would be most influential over the next two generations throughout the world in advancing certain principles about the proper role of government. That is to say, Hayek's views, which were that the purest and freest expression of people's preferences and of entrepreneurial activity would be unfettered markets. His view was that public intervention was inefficient, distorted processes, and was a plague on economic society. And that view, Hayek's view, resonated with economists everywhere. The Chicago School of Economics, of course, embraced this and used it to advance their views, some of which were helpful and many of which were not. Hayek's views were echoed by President Reagan, who declared early in his administration the government was not the solution, government was the problem. And it was echoed by any number of international agencies who advanced as prescriptions for all sorts of ills, privatization of public enterprise. And in fact, there was a very long list of policies that were implemented in the next 20, 30, really 40 years after this sort of signaling of the revolution. Privatization policies took hold in many countries with thousands, tens of thousands of public enterprise moved into the private sector. In the United States, where we always had much less in the way of public enterprise, the analogous transformation was deregulation, which took lots and lots of industries, from airlines to electricity and lots of things in between, from heavily regulated status to something much more like free markets. This also had an expression in the ratcheting back of antitrust policy, of competition policy in the US, with a much more permissive view toward mergers, with views that were much more accommodating to a variety of practices previously viewed as anti-competitive, but for which clever people, many of them economists, could devise explanations as to why they might be good things after all. This involved diminished support for infrastructure. Our public infrastructure in this country has languished badly. Our transportation infrastructure is stalled. Our broadband infrastructure pales in comparison to 10 or 15 other countries. R&D support has not diminished in dollar terms, but now lags several other major countries, putting the US at a relative comparative disadvantage going forward in technology advancement as well. We've injected markets into places where we might not have thought they had a place: private prisons, vouchers and charter schools as educational innovations. And economists and policymakers have looked for and found many other opportunities to replace other structures, other institutions with markets and with competition. We have an uncritical embrace of free trade, which, at least in my view and many others, is much too uncritical. It fails to understand the limitations of these intellectual propositions that many people find so very attractive. And that it finds expression in the opposition to industrial policy. To the point that industrial policy in this country and in many places has become really a dirty word or two. This was not always the case. We have in this country and a very long history of support for antitrust and regulation. So this is my 30,000-foot view of some issues, and then I will focus on the specifics of intervention. But it's important to recognize that we've always had 2 or 3 types of intervention with very long histories and pretty good track records in this country. Antitrust and industry regulation are 2 of them. These are, as I describe here, responses to the difference between free markets, which is a lot of what we hear about, and competitive markets. Whenever I hear someone say free markets, I immediately ask exactly what do you mean by that? Because oftentimes it means unfettered markets without intervention. But that is not quite what the economic proposition tells us is likely to be a good thing. Competitive markets have certain necessary assumptions, and if those are met, they're pretty good at responding to consumers' preferences. They're pretty good at harnessing entrepreneurial activities. We default to competitive markets in most cases in this country. The markets that are not competitive, even if they are apparently free, cannot have no claim to the same beneficial outcomes. And most markets work pretty well. It's the small fraction of those that don't that, of course, attract our attention. Most markets do not require government intervention. Where intervention is required, 2 methods of doing so. One is antitrust, which, as you know, sets essentially rules of the game, prohibiting price-fixing arrangements, cartels, prohibits large mergers meeting certain criteria, and oversees and prohibits various types of anti-competitive practices. Regulation, industry regulation, is really more focused on utilities and infrastructure industries that cannot be expected to function competitively due to high scale costs. And so we can talk more about that, but suffice it to say that these have long histories. They go back to the 1800s in this country and have pretty good, as I say, track records over time. Antitrust can be thought of as preventive industrial policy. Many troubled industries in this country and elsewhere are troubled because they have drifted into being complacent oligopolies, small numbers of firms that have lost their way. They have failed to respond to customers' interests. They have lost their focus on new technology. They no longer are sufficiently concerned about their cost structures. And this all makes them vulnerable to outside forces, like imports, for example, or new technologies that might arise from somewhere else. The automobile industry, the steel industry, and others in this country fall into that category of industries that did not need to meet the fate that they did. So stronger competition is a good preventive medicine. It means that the industry may be able to resurrect itself, become a stronger competitor, and defend itself better against onslaughts from new technologies, from imports, from wherever this may occur. And antitrust has done this. The breakup of AT&T 30 years ago, the breakup of Standard Oil 100 years ago, and a lot of other such measures have restructured industries in ways that have injected competition where otherwise it did not exist. Efforts on the part of some companies like Microsoft to handicap entry and to exert take other measures that prevent competition from flowering, these too have been addressed through the antitrust process. So antitrust has fairly broad political support, as I say, at least in principle. People diverge, the political parties diverge, economists diverge, and policymakers diverge in many cases in actual practice. It's fair to say that it has, as I'll describe in more concrete terms briefly, it's fair to say that antitrust has had less success in reforming industries in advance of trouble, witness autos and steel, where it really did not have so much success. But other cases, it has at least taken a crack at a very difficult problem. The U.S. has also intervened. We have a long history of intervention, direct intervention in industries. We provide support to the private sector, especially infrastructure questions. We have supported over 200 years investments in all sorts of transportation infrastructure, local public utilities, massive public works, of course, of the 1930s, something which was under the ruse of a national defense program, the Interstate Highway Program in the 1950s, and R&D in defense establishments, national labs, and universities. And we've also intervened much more directly to defend and rescue certain companies and sectors. Lockheed, savings and loans in the 1980s, airlines after 9/11, and the automobile industry. So what I want to talk about is really this last question about direct involvement, direct intervention in industries and companies in distress. What I describe here as rescuing companies when they reach particularly acute stages of distress and, in some sense, run the risk of complete collapse or failure. And what I'd like to do is to, since we started in Sweden, we'll sort of take a little travel log and go to Detroit in 1979. This is an industry that Barry knows well. Chrysler during the year 1979 reported a loss of $1 billion, which at that time was a lot of money. It's dwarfed by, they managed to top that several more recently, but in that period of time, it was a great deal of money, and it was in grave danger of collapse. most of the people recognized that the problems were largely of their own making. This was a company that had truly lost its way. Its products, its costs, technology, and most of all, its management was asleep at the switch. And Chrysler was not unique in that regard. The quaint notion of the big three, the same problems affected GM and Ford as well. And at the time, there was a great debate in Washington and elsewhere about the merits or wisdom of government intervention. Policymakers were concerned about spillovers from the collapse. So the Congressional Budget Office estimated there might be job losses of about 350 or 360,000 jobs from a collapse of Chrysler, and there would be spillovers onto the communities and their finances, onto suppliers, onto dealers. This is a vast industry with spin-offs in a great many dimensions, both geographic and product dimensions. Others, of course, argued, these arguments are now familiar, that Chrysler should be allowed to fail. After all, these were its own mistakes, and it should bear the brunt of those mistakes. And one thing the argument went that we should avoid doing is ensuring, that is, protecting bad management from the consequences of their own decisions. The market, it was said, will shift resources to those better able to manage them. This, of course, is the market for corporate control that has been all the rage in some business schools, at least, as a method for allocating resources. If one company is not managing resources so well, someone will take it over, or the resources will migrate into better uses. Well, the no bailout argument is a completely sound economic proposition under certain specific conditions. And what I'd like to do is to talk about what those conditions are, because it is an argument worth hearing. In fact, we don't bail out most industries or most firms as they're about to go under. So there must be something that distinguishes an arguable case from one that doesn't concern us at all. So I would say that there are criteria, limiting principles of the sort that I've just listed here, almost lost, about when it is that a bailout, government intervention with assistance to a firm or industry, has economic merit. But one is where, or I should put it, my proposition here is the other way around, when we should not, in fact, get involved. One is when labor markets can absorb the workers that might lose jobs in company A, call it Chrysler, where the labor market can absorb those workers because they can move into more or less parallel jobs, that is, utilizing their skills, preserving their human capital, and securing wages commensurate with their skills. That is to say, there's little or only modest loss of wages as well as maintenance of employment. So this is not going to be true at times where there are macro problems, because as it would almost necessarily be the case under those circumstances, finding alternative employment is a pretty tricky business. Similarly, in order not to waste physical capital, it ought to be the case that no bailout makes sense when it's most likely that physical capital can be put to other good uses, and reasonably quickly. Empty factories is lost investment, and if they can't be used for anything else, that, much like lost human capital, is a cost to economic society. Another condition for not bailing out a company or industry would be if there are few input or output connections. That is, if the industry does not have large spillovers onto other sectors. So that if there's a lot of purchases that it makes, which is to say that its input costs are, its purchase is not vertically integrated to the point of not needing much in the way of outside inputs, but if it purchases a great deal from other industries, then those other industries will be adversely affected. Or if its output is crucial to some downstream industry, then there too there will be spillover effects. Absent those, no bailout makes more sense. And lastly, it may be under some circumstances more feasible, more likely, to be able to reorganize an industry, a company in particular, under alternative management or with alternative financing. That is, someone may be waiting in the wings to take over the company and to restore its operations fairly quickly. So under these conditions, walking away from a crisis firm or industry may be perfectly sound public policy. But if the conditions don't hold, the reverse may be the case. There may be a good case for assistance. That doesn't mean automatically there should be assistance, because much depends on the nature of the assistance and on the timing and on the prospects for success. So at the time that Chrysler was facing the abyss, there actually already had been several inquiries into competition in the automobile industry. The Justice Department and then the Federal Trade Commission both conducted antitrust inquiries into competition problems in the 1970s and 1980s in the automobile industry. I was at the FTC at the time and had the staff of economists who were working on this. We opened and conducted essentially a fairly standard antitrust inquiry into the reasons for GM's continued dominance. We examined pricing practices, we examined the track record on innovation, we looked at cost issues, we looked at its lock on exclusive dealers, and other problems of competition in the industry. The idea was to see if antitrust could help restore or revitalize competition in the industry for the benefit both of consumers, who were getting a lot of bad cars at that time, and the companies themselves, because even in the 70s and 80s it was pretty clear that there were threats to that industry on the horizon. The efforts did not succeed. Antitrust is a blunt instrument for these types of purposes. And the staff that I headed and worked the issues that we worked on quickly were superseded by the Chrysler, by the travails of Chrysler. And so the broader economic questions about competition in the industry were kind of trumped by the need in Washington to address these issues. At the time, the staff that we had become known around Washington for its expertise in autos, and we were actually called on by lots of different agencies to discuss with them issues about competitive effects of regulation, and the Chrysler matter, as well as issues of competition. I remember at one point the FTC was asked by the House Banking Committee to testify, this was in late 1979, on Chrysler's financial predicament and on the issue of its possible collapse. And the person who would go was an individual by the name of Al Doherty, who was the head of the Bureau of Competition, the lead attorney in the FTC, and a skilled Washington lawyer, both in private practice and in his tenure in public service. And I and some others were involved in briefing him on a couple of occasions in the office of the chairman of the FTC at the time, Mike Kirchhoff. And after a couple of these meetings and the briefings that I and others offered to Al Doherty, Mike turned to me and said, maybe I should accompany Al to the House hearing. And I said, well, okay. And Mike assured me that my role was sort of a potted plant, that no questions were likely to come my way, that Al would answer the questions. But on many occasions, obviously, people who go and testify have support staff or others capable of answering more technical questions with them should it indeed arise. And so I felt fine because, again, my role was really to be little more than a spectator, and I assumed that would be the case. And I was fine with that role until we walked into the hearing room and discovered that Kwoka, the iconic chairman of Chrysler, had just preceded us, and the room was filled with television cameras and lights and reporters and crowds of everybody waiting to hear everybody in the afternoon session who was going to speak. And Al Doherty and I went to the witness table, and at that point, my confidence was shaking because I realized that his hands were trembling. Okay, so I wasn't sure what I was doing there, if he was put off by the setting. Still, we got through most of the hearing fine. all the questions he answered. And then the question came up, this was a question about 2/3 of the way through, and it returned to the issue about what would happen if, in fact, Chrysler collapsed, and Al gave the answer that we all had rehearsed, which is that, well, the FTC had no position on the merits of whether it should be allowed to go under or not. That everybody wanted to get out there. But we anticipated that there would be significant disruption, certainly to employers and suppliers and dealers of Chrysler as a result. And this seemed to say nothing more than the obvious. And then Al asked me if I wanted to add anything. And for some reason, I was either bored or decided to play economist. And reading back my answer in the transcript, it doesn't sound so bad. But it took the FTC's press office 2 days, nonstop, of answering inquiries, trying to explain to people that I had not really meant what I obviously had said. And I gave an answer that, like I said, didn't sound so bad. And if you read it, no one would be particularly, I think, incensed by this. But it did say, that absolutely that there would be disruption. But it is true that the demand for cars wouldn't go away, that there would be demand growth that other auto companies would experience, and even the plants and workers might well find their way back into the system fairly soon. And so this was, of course, was interpreted as saying, well, so what if Chrysler goes under, right? Not to worry. And like I say, the press office was quite busy trying to explain that away. So Mike Perchuk and Al, too, were very kind to me afterwards and supported all the work that I did within the FTC, but for some reason, I was never asked to accompany him. But anyway, the FTC did believe it had a role, and if it had the right tools, it seems to me that antitrust policy and an inquiry like that could have made a difference in the industry. So in the event, Congress passed the Loan Guarantee Act in December of that year, and Chrysler got $1.5 billion of loan guarantees. And now, this is the part that I focus on. Chrysler was required as part of the deal to get some concessions from different stakeholders, dealers and suppliers and workers as well. But there was no actual requirement imposed on Chrysler to revamp its operations, to change its products. There was no replacement of management. So Chrysler emerged intact, of course, from this experience, and the bailout was viewed as successful. But it essentially gave the company free money without the need for remedial actions. So this, in my view, was a good illustration of a term that's now worked its way into the popular lexicon, moral hazard. So something that economists and finance labs could only have appreciated 10 or 15 years ago. But moral hazard, as we know, involves changes in people's future behavior for lack of penalizing them or facing the adverse consequences of their actions now. And so the fact that Chrysler did not have to modify its internal operations, did not have to replace management, did not really have to address the deep-seated problems within the company that made it into a vulnerable target, the fact that it did not have to do that sowed the seeds of future trouble. And it made it more likely, as I say here, that Detroit, the big three, would have to return to Washington. Well, that was 1979. It didn't take very long. So in 1982, Japanese car imports had doubled in 5 years. The big three's production had fallen by a third. Employment was down by nearly 150,000 and dropping steadily. That's a good number now, but it wasn't at the time. And the big three asked for help from Washington, concocting this claim that somehow this was the import competition was a surprise to them, and they needed more time, they needed breathing room to get their act together to respond to the challenge. And the Reagan administration imposed quotas on imports from Japan in 1981, and they ran for several years afterwards. So this was not a direct subsidy or a loan guarantee. This wasn't a check written to Chrysler, but it was protection from competition for the products of Chrysler and the other U.S. auto companies, and it allowed prices to rise. What else happens when you reduce quantity? And sure enough, prices rose. All the studies have shown that. And what did the U.S. companies do? Well, there might have been a hope that they would use the time and money to do as they said they would, to improve their products, improve their operations, strengthen their management. But they didn't do any of those things. They pocketed the money. They said thank you and took the money. That is to say, they enjoyed higher prices and did, once again, very little to fundamentally reform operations. This is bad policy. These are the kinds of experiences that give intervention a deservedly bad reputation. This is poor industrial policy. It's why industrial policy has a bad name. And it is dreadful for consumers and ultimately only a short-term, temporary palliative for the industry. Let's fast forward. 4 years ago, the big three, so-called big three, no longer really the big three, but the traditional Detroit automakers, faced what a lot of companies did, sales and production declines, but theirs had really been in long-term decline for deep-seated reasons in the industry. And sales truly collapsed during the financial crisis. GM, Ford, and Chrysler sales literally fell by about 50%. And for a high fixed cost industry, this is just a devastating proposition. The $1 billion loss that Chrysler faced was nothing. GM in one quarter reported a $9 billion loss. Okay? I mean, that's something like $2,000 for every car it sold in the quarter. And that was followed by another quarter where it announced a $6 billion loss. So these were gigantic financial costs to these companies. And in truth, there was a true threat that the companies would collapse. And it was clear that there would be substantial spillovers. Studies have been done. We understand that there are supplier and dealer networks throughout the country that the U.S. auto industry employs. If you add it all up, a couple million people are directly or indirectly affected. Repair shops, gas stations, you name it. A collapse of the industry and sales, forget what I said about other people picking up the pieces and moving on, that was not going to happen if the entire industry essentially faced this kind of dire state of affairs. We have the same debate, as I'm sure many of you recognize, that we've had before for the auto industry and other industries as well. So I have a quotation up here from someone who argued against the bailout. And if you read it, you can read it as well as I. It says, if General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler get the bailout that their CEOs are asking for, the automakers will stay the suicidal course of declining shares, insurmountable labor and retiree burdens, technological atrophy, product inferiority. Who do you suppose said this? Mitt Romney, exactly. I'm supposed to, the theme of this is advice to the So here's the next quotation, which I'll let you read and then let me ask you who you think said this. This says more prescriptively what Detroit should do. New labor agreements, management as it is must go, get people from outside, sanity in salaries and perks, investments for the future, including fuel-saving designs. Do not give shareholders and bondholders a free pass. Who do you suppose said this? Any guesses?
Obama? Bill McKibben.
Mitt Romney. The famous editorial, op-ed piece rather, that he wrote in mid-2008 saying, "Let Detroit go bankrupt." Everyone knows the first part of it. The rest of his story is this. I've taken it, and these are direct quotes. I've moved some things around. These are direct quotes from that. He has tried to make much of this, as you may know. He's tried to maneuver his position so that it doesn't sound like unalterable opposition to bailout. He's tried to take credit, really, for the kind of bankruptcy process that Chrysler did go through. Because, he does say that if they get the bailout they asked for, but they didn't get the bailout they asked for. My point is that they did not get the bailout they asked for. Detroit got something similar, though not identical, in at least one important respect to what the rest of Romney's proposal was. So there was this, we'll explain that in a moment, but they're clearly, the Council of Economic Advisors estimated that there'd be more than a million jobs lost if the auto industry really faced these dire consequences, particularly in the weak economy. People argued for concern about adverse effects on suppliers, and the suppliers not just supplied the auto industry, but supplied other sectors, manufacturing sectors of the economy as well, the loss of human capital, the loss of physical capital, all the things that I mentioned before. And then there were individuals who neither were, like Romney, opposed to the bailout, apparently, nor those who argued for government intervention, but then some had this more nuanced view. So this is a participation part of the program. So who do you suppose said, sometimes circumstances get in the way of philosophy. We should do it again. George Bush. So he said, I would do it again. I dropped that out so not to give it away. But Bush in 2012, in a speech, I've forgotten exactly where, was asked about the Detroit bailout. And he said, I would do it again. He said that sometimes philosophy has to yield to circumstance. So what in fact was done? Well, as you may recall, what was done was that during 2008, at the very end of his term, the Bush administration provided interim financing to GM and Chrysler. Ford was under new management. Outside the industry, the first CEO ever to be the head of any of the big three in Detroit was Mullally at Ford, who came from Boeing, and immediately, starting in 2006, I think he came in, started to transform that company to the point that they did not need financing. They did a number of other quite perceptive and creative things as well. But anyway, GM and Chrysler were the two companies needing public support, and Bush provided interim financing during late calendar 2008 and left to the Obama administration to fill in the blanks as we look farther ahead. So Obama provided longer-term financing. As it says here, some of the conditions were very familiar. They had to obtain concessions from all the usual suspects. But now, and much more importantly, GM was told as a condition of support that it would have to find a partner, because the Obama administration's Treasury Department had an office on auto industry affairs that had determined that Chrysler was non-viable as a standalone company. GM was required to restructure its operations, to drop some of its proliferation of brands. Both companies were instructed to close plants, to reduce dealer networks, to change their product lineups. Both CEOs were replaced, fired for all intents and purposes. Incompetents like Nardelli at Chrysler and Wagner at GM. Board members who had protected bad management were replaced. And both of the companies were taken through a government-managed bankruptcy. People feared private bankruptcy, if the companies themselves took themselves into bankruptcy, because those tend to be chaotic affairs with uncertain outcomes and take forever. The government-managed bankruptcy in the case of Chrysler took 32 days, and in the case of GM, took about 37 days. These are Mach 10 speeds for bankruptcy, and it was because the individuals in charge of this, Stephen Ratner at the Treasury Department in particular, had a clear idea of what was necessary, and armed with good talent, pushed through not just the proposal in Congress to secure the financing for this, but also pushed through in the administrative process and the legal proceedings to make it happen. This is what I call a hard bailout. No blank checks. Money was simply not given out directly or indirectly, with some hope that things would turn around and work out for the best. Rather, there was a transformation of the structure of the operation and a replacement of the bad actors, the personnel who had already demonstrated that they were not the people to lead the companies forward. And so the first principle hard bailouts is to be sure to change the operations, because only in that way can you change the incentives within the company and change the way the company behaves in the market. The problem always, of course, is that we're worried about moral hazard. We save one company, even, as it was done in the case of Chrysler and GM, other companies will decide that this is not the worst possible outcome for them. And as a result, this tends to, the fear is, breed more such cases of people engaged in reckless or incompetent behavior that puts them too at the doorstep of Congress for future assistance. But it seems to me that there is a partial solution to the problem of moral hazard. And the problem of moral hazard is a very real problem. But there is a partial solution to it. And the partial solution was illustrated nicely by the actions taken in 2008 and 2009. What you do is you separate the rescue of the company, which clearly had to be done, in my view, and many people's views, from rescuing the people who were responsible for the troubles in the first place. So you get rid of the individuals. You ensure that they do not leave with terrific bonus packages. You institute legal proceedings in some other cases, not in the auto industry where it's just incompetence, not illegality, but in other cases where there's criminal behavior, you prosecute. And so you strip the company of all of the people who are responsible for the trouble. And what that means is that the next set of managers, board members, and CEOs of these companies will know that they personally won't be around to benefit. They won't survive any future crisis of the company that they may be responsible for. So the future company, if it runs into trouble, may have recourse, may have need for recourse, and there may be a judgment to save the company again. But you never, ever allow the individuals responsible to survive the process. So I think you can separate the actions of individuals from the need for taking action to rescue the company. And I think that that partially addresses the concern that everyone has about moral hazard. This, I think, are the two principles for how to get involved in rescuing companies. No blank checks, and deal with moral hazard by removing personnel. Well, if we learn that, Detroit, as we know, has actually done a pretty good job of resurrecting itself. And I won't way past time, so let me quickly, I guess, you know this, Detroit's in pretty good shape. Without exaggerating what its present circumstance, it certainly has stabilized and is recovering. So this is a good test case for industrial policy. Let me offer this slide for guiding principles for government involvement. One is to limit involvement to companies that have these three properties. One is these systemic effects, this substantial interconnectedness with surrounding complementary sectors. The spillovers represent risks for the wider economic community and activity. Secondly, for there to be involvement, there should be a lack of reasonable alternatives for labor and capital resources. That is, there must be impediments to mobility or lack of alternative opportunities so that people don't move from good skilled jobs at the wages into flipping burgers or doing nothing. And thirdly, you intervene if there's a lack of plausible private alternatives. No one's going to step in with management and financing capable of resurrecting the company. So the second broad principle is to take full control and be sure you transform the companies. Don't write checks or grant indirect dollars with import quotas. You must change the operations in order to change incentives. Thirdly, hold individuals responsible. By penalizing bad conduct and the actors that do it, you change expectations for future actors. You deter bad acting by making clear that it won't be rewarded. And lastly, you get out as soon as possible. We've been in GM too long. It creates adverse publicity, ambiguity about why the company did this versus did that, whether it was being pressured by the government or whether there was an internal decision. It's time to get out. But that is the least of the lessons. Yeah. If I can take 3 more minutes, I need to.
We really do have to go to some questions. We're way over.
I apologize.
But thank you.
So let me just say, let me take 1 minute of the time that I don't have and say that if we learned something from the automobile experience, we seem to unlearn it in the case of Wall Street. Because in the case of Wall Street, sure enough, there are lots of institutions in trouble, many of them of their own making. And I do believe, like a lot of economists and policymakers, that there are very good reasons for intervention. But the bailout that was actually undertaken gave them money, the government took ownership and had the ability to do what it did in autos, but did not do it. Jamie Dimon is there, Lloyd Blankfein is there, other individuals who were there at the time of trouble and responsible for some of the trouble have survived just fine. There's been little effort to change the institutions or the individuals responsible within them. There's been no break-up with the banks. We've created a moral hazard problem within these institutions that I think holds grave risks for the future. And the oddity is that this is not comparing what we did well with Chrysler in 2008, or the auto industry rather, in 2008, with some earlier time. This is the same administration. Right. This is the left hand and the right hand doing quite different things. And it's quite an interesting question why it is that the same administration had 2 quite different policies toward different sectors of the economy, both in some trouble. I will leave that hopefully for a question you might ask later.